All right, I'm very excited to join you here today. I am an entomologist, as we said before, and I get to talk about one of the insects that I find the most fascinating. One of the ones that for me really kind of started it all. When I was a young kid, I remember playing with Japanese beetles, and I was fascinated by sort of their biology and the way that they just seem to be able to mow through everything. And then as I became an entomologist at Purdue and then at UK, just learning about the history of this insect is quite fascinating, and the way that it has interacted with our country, with our government, and how it's helped form some of the foundations of how we deal with invasive species. And so just kind of on that front, I wanted to start with by talking about how it gets here. As you can tell with the name Japanese beetle, it's really not from around these parts. It is native to the main islands of Japan, so some of the larger islands that are a part of that country, and it was imported to the United States. Some of the researchers in the 60s and 70s, they estimate that it arrived as early as 1911. Some other apocryphal lore that is associated with Japanese beetles are that they came in with some shipments that were for a World's Fair over in the New Jersey area. But regardless of which way that it went, they got here in the early 1910s, and they weren't confirmed until 1916. And this is when some folks gathered and caught about a dozen Japanese beetles at a tree nursery outside of Riverton, New Jersey. They didn't know what they were. They kind of put them in a jar and preserved them and then stuck them on a shelf. And somebody got around to identifying them the next year. And it turned out that they were these non-native pests, and that they were something we needed to look into more. So they ended up talking with Japanese scientists. It's considered a minor agricultural pest there, nothing like what it became here in the United States. There were some early attempts at quarantines in this area. The nursery industry actually fought these kind of tooth and nail. There's a large nursery in Philadelphia that really sort of fought legislation, fought the government on this because it was restricting their access to Japanese products and their ability to ship things around. And unfortunately, the quarantines ended up not working and the beetle got out. If you look at the situation kind of as it currently stands, the most up-to-date papers that are published on this, they'll tell you that the beetle is established fully in 28 different states, and it continues to spread westward. There was originally kind of this estimation that it would never cross the Mississippi River, and that it definitely wouldn't establish in a lot of the high plains states. Think about Nebraska, Wyoming, Colorado, places like that, because there's just not enough water that comes down. There's not enough sky water, rain, and everything. But we unfortunately helped this beetle out quite a bit by having irrigated landscapes and golf courses and parks where we take care of grass. So there is somewhere for them to end up laying their eggs. And so because of that, we have seen them pop up with detections, at least in 13 additional states. Some of the key sort of detections that have occurred are on the West Coast. California is very, very nervous about this insect. The reason that Louisville is highlighted on this map is because there's a lot of shipments that come out of the Louisville airport and then go west to California. And when that happens, those planes are heavily inspected. There's a guideline in case they do find Japanese beetles kind of hanging out on the wings or in the cargo bay area, because we don't want to ship this from the bluegrass state out to the California area and end up infesting that place. They've been fighting some battles. You can see those counties in yellow. Those are detections. And then those have been mostly eradicated in the case of this map from when it was produced. But a lot of this movement, as I was kind of just hinting at, it's really mediated by humans. We have been our own worst enemy with this and lots of other invasive species. We've unfortunately shipped it around, but there has been some natural spread from New Jersey up into the eastern seaboard, all the way over to Kentucky. We've been dealing with this pest in Kentucky for quite some time. We're not newcomers to it. I used to work in Nebraska, and it was very interesting when I was there. They ended up with a Japanese beetle invasion. A lot of people had never seen it before. They'd never heard of it before. They thought that it was some sort of beautiful ladybug at first. And then it was just kind of this educational blitz to try to get them to understand what they were looking at. And I feel like that's very different than what we experience here in Kentucky, where we've been fighting this insect for probably close to 100 years. In regards to identification of it, it is a fairly distinctive looking insect, but I just wanted to show you it and compare it to some other insects that it can be confused for. So this beetle as an adult is about 1/2 inch long. They have a bright metallic green head. They have kind of copper colored elytra. Those are those hardened top wings that you see on beetles. And then these beetles are famous for having these distinct tufts of white hair along the abdomen edge. So they have kind of white hair on their belly along the sides. Maybe some of you sympathize with that. But these stick off on the side, and they help to separate it from things like the false Japanese beetle, which is kind of a color. In terms of color, it looks similar to the Japanese beetle, a little more faded out, I would say. Maybe sepia toned is another way of putting it. And it doesn't quite match up with the bright coloration that we see with Japanese beetles. And they do lack those distinct tufts of white hair along the side. But you can find these in different parts of the country. And then the dogbane leaf beetle is another one that often gets confused for the Japanese beetle just based on coloration. They have that kind of coppery color to their wings, but as you shift your perspective on them, they do kind of change color depending on which direction you're looking at them, but mainly they have that kind of bright metallic green. Their antennae look quite different compared to a Japanese beetles. Japanese beetles have lamellate antennae, so their antennae look like when you put your thumb on your forehead and stick your fingers out like this. That is what their antennae look like. These look more like long threads that are very similar in size across all the segments of the antenna. And then also they don't have the hair tufts on the side. And then the green June beetle, another one that I think is commonly associated with this beetle, with Japanese beetles. And that's because they often pop up at the same places. Green June beetle will follow Japanese beetles around and actually feed behind them. So Japanese beetles, I'll show you their mouth here in a little bit. It's a very sharp mouth part that they have. So they're able to pierce green grapes, unripened fruit with those sharp scissor-like mouth parts. Green June beetle, on the other hand, their teeth are more like spoons. They usually can only feed on overripened fruit. But when Japanese beetles pierce these unripened fruits and semi-ripe fruits, they're able to take advantage of those. They'll feed behind the Japanese beetles and they get access to a lot more food. These are a lot bigger and beefier in comparison to Japanese beetles. They're about an inch long or longer. They have green and gold coloration rather than green and copper coloration, and their bodies are a lot broader compared to the Japanese beetles. These can be a minor pest. We don't consider them to be a major agricultural or turf pest, but they do pop up sporadically, causing a lot of damage. And then finally, one of the others that I get a lot of questions about, people will say, oh, my home is invaded by Japanese beetles. And it turns out that they have this insect, the multicolored Asian lady beetle. They're confused because they both have Asian or Asian country names in their common name, and people just sort of use them interchangeably. There's a lot of distinction here. These are lady beetles. They're true ladybugs. So they have the spots, that kind of domed shape to their body. They don't have any tufts of white hair. And these outside are predatory. They feed on aphids and lots of other insects. They don't feed on plants at all, but they do become a fall invader. They'll come into homes in the winter. Many of you have no doubt experienced this, your attic being full of these kind of orangey colored ladybugs. But they're not from Japan. They're from the mainland of Asia, and their name is distinctly different. Asian lady beetles instead of Japanese beetles. So those are some ones that get confused with the star of our show here today. In regards to the Japanese beetle and its development, it has what we call univolting. They have only one generation per year, and we're very thankful for that. Otherwise, we would probably incur a lot more damage from these insects. But the sort of boil it down to the simplest terms, they emerge as adults right around now. We're coming into the prime Japanese beetle emergence season here in Kentucky. Some of our Western friends out in the Western counties, they probably either have had the first ones emerge, or maybe in the next day or two, you'll have them emerge. They come out at 1,030 growing degree days, typically. So right around now, they're going to be coming out as adults, flying, feeding, mating, putting their eggs in the soil in the early part of summer. Then as summer progresses into fall, they go through 3 instars, 3 stages of growth for their grub stage. Once they reach the 3rd instar, the biggest one, they're ready to overwinter. Around October, they'll start burrowing deeper in the soil. They want to get below the frost line, and then they wait out the winter in those cold periods with that nice insulation of soil, thatch, and turf above them. And then in the spring, they'll move back up closer to the surface and pupate, and then emerge as adults the following month. So they don't feed in the spring. They do move to the surface. All of the feeding action is happening in the summer into the fall. In terms of when they emerge, the males come out first. Males look a little different when you compare them to the females. It's not coloration or antenna or anything like that. It's a very specific sexual dimorphism here. They have spurs on the front legs. The males have pointy spurs that are kind of small. You can see them pointed to with these red arrows on the left. On the right, we have a female. Her spurs are bigger and broader. They look a little more like spoons, and they're used for digging. So she uses these to be able to tunnel back into the earth and lay her eggs later on, while the males have these sharp claws that kind of help them to hang on to things or to battle with one another. The reason that the males emerge first is that then they kind of like hover around in a given area and they're waiting for the females to start coming out. When the female first crawls up out of the soil, she produces a very potent sexual pheromone. It's called a virginal pheromone because she's never been mated with before. This virginal pheromone, it drives the males wild. If you've ever looked in a lawn and you've seen Japanese beetles just kind of going ballistic in the grass, it's because of this virginal pheromone that's being produced. And the reason that it drives them nuts is because when they mate with this female, after she emerges, it guarantees they get to be a dad, because the first person that mates with her, the first beetle that mates with her, she will accept that sperm and turn around and fertilize her eggs and go back down into the soil. It guarantees you being a dad. So they'll fight each other for this opportunity because they want to pass on their genetics. It's a scene reminiscent of any bar in Kentucky on a Friday night, just a bunch of dudes hassling a bunch of women that weren't really asking for it, basically. The females will feed and remate over the next 4 to 6 weeks, so they don't just have this one mating. She will enter the soil up to 12 times in order to lay batches of 40 to 60 eggs each time. So you can see how there's so many of them. If she's able to pump out 400 to 600 eggs kind of on her own, that's going to be very helpful in building these large populations. And each of these will be fathered by a different beetle. She fertilizes the eggs with the most recent sperm that she's received. And that means that males often will stay attached to the female in the mating position. I won't get any more graphic than that, but they're kind of plugged in the back of her here, and then they lay on top of her and they won't let her get away. They'll do this for up to 2 hours. They'll guard her to try and force her into the soil to lay eggs with their sperm. So they get a little overbearing, a little overprotective, and the males will fight one another in order to accomplish this. They will wrestle and joust. If you've ever seen beetles kind of stacked 3 or 4 deep on a leaf, especially in this right-hand image, the one on top is a male that's guarding a female. This other male has found the pair, and he's trying to muscle the one on top off so that he can mate with the female and try to become the dad of her kids instead. So it's all pandemonium out there. It's constantly trying to make the next generation, and it's just a lot of eating and mating. It's like Mardi Gras all the time for Japanese beetles. Some other interesting things with Japanese beetles, we often get a question at the extension office or at the entomology office about if people can crush Japanese beetles. People read online that when you crush a Japanese beetle, it makes this smell that will bring hundreds or thousands more to your property. And that's not true. They don't produce an aggregation pheromone. Lady beetles do, but Japanese beetles do not. These insects instead use the damage they cause to leaves to find one another. It's a lot like a shark with blood in the water. When they feed on these leaves, the leaves will emit a chemical cue that says, hey, this is a damaged leaf that's being fed on by Japanese beetles. Other beetles will follow that smell, and then they find one another there and mate. And the more they feed on the leaf, the more of this smell is produced. We have data from the University of Kentucky that shows a damaged leaf recruits 10 to 20 times more beetles than an undamaged one does. The volatiles, as they leak out, this happens at the highest during 1200 to 1500 hours in the day. So kind of in the evening time. This is when peak Japanese beetle flight just happens to be, and when most mating occurs. So this is how they're finding one another. And if you can get rid of the damaged leaves, or if you can prevent more of the damage from occurring, even through something like physical control, you'll see fewer beetles on plants that are even susceptible to their feeding. So it's one way that we can kind of manipulate their biology to our own ends. After the mating, when the female goes to the soil to lay her eggs, she's going to do so in the upper 3 inches of the sod and down into the soil. The eggs, as you can see on the right, they look kind of like the eggs that we eat, similar shape and coloration. They will tend to oviposit in the area where they've been feeding as an adult, but they can also be highly mobile. They will fly for miles in order to find an ideal site for their eggs. They like to be kind of picky. They want moderate soil texture, an area that is sunny. They like moderate to high soil moisture and a short grass cover. Unfortunately, that is essentially the description for almost every home lawn in America, almost all of our golf courses and our parks and sports fields. So we provide tons and tons of spaces for them to be able to lay their eggs. And it's bad for us because these are the places where we can't afford damage. When the eggs hatch, they'll do that in about 10 to 14 days after being laid. The grubs develop over the next 5 to 7 weeks. These are the 3 different instars I mentioned before. So the first one lasts for 2 to 3 weeks. The second one lasts for another 3 to 4 weeks. And then the overwintering stage is that large grub that will go further into the soil in order to avoid the frost line. The eggs in first instar grubs are very sensitive to temperature and moisture fluctuation. So we actually have a lot of them die, particularly during summers where there's a drought. They don't do well when it's dry. So these past couple of summers have not been very kind to them. They're also very delicious to ants and other predators. Ants are known to eat about 20 to 25% of the grubs that are in the landscape. You can see these ones, they're getting ready to chop that white grub up Benihana style and take some grub steaks home to feed to one another. They're very helpful because they're able to do this in the turf. When they move below the frost line, it's usually around the 6-inch mark, but they've been found as deep as 8 to 10 inches as well. So they're getting pretty low. This keeps that soil and thatch above them so that the cold never quite reaches them. So even when we have these Arctic blasts like we got just this last December across much of Kentucky, they were not impacted. They never felt that cold because there's just so much between them and those cool air temperatures. When they move towards the surface in March and April, they may nibble a little bit on that early turf, but usually they just pupate, and then they're in that state for about 7 to 17 days before they emerge as an adult. When they're an adult, they feed on over 300 species of plants and 79 different families. Some of their favorites include walnuts, birches, elms, lindens, fruit trees, grapes, and roses. They love these kinds of plants. There's something about the way that they taste that really matches up with what they need. They will nibble on almost every plant in the landscape, but these preferred hosts, they have a mixture of sort of alcohols and sugars and things in their leaf tissue that appeals to them, and it induces more damage. More damage induces more beetles to visit that plant, as I said before. They tend to start at the top of the plant and move their way down. That way they prolong their period of time that they can feed on it. If they started at the bottom and went up, that's going to shorten the amount of time that they can be with that plant. So this is a linden tree on UK's campus between July 8th and July 18th. And you can see in about 10 days, these beetles have induced an early autumn and knocked a lot of leaves off this plant. This isn't lethal. The plant will be fine. It'll grow another flush of leaves most likely. If this happens year after year after year after year, you could end up with problems, but usually this is just kind of a speed bump in the road for that tree. But if you have an annual plant, of course, that's a little different. Or if we're talking about an agricultural commodity, that's very different. These are those sharp teeth that I was talking about before. They have these really scissor-like mandibles that they use to chew between the leaf veins. And when they do this, they leave behind the vein tissue to create skeletonized damage. We also call it lacy damage in some cases, just because it looks like a doily as they feed on that leaf and leave those veins behind. They can also feed on fruits. Grapes and peaches commonly fall prey to Japanese beetles, and they love flowers. Here's a rose that's been completely pulverized by Japanese beetle activity. They love to chew into and hollow out the fruits. Just imagine taking a bite out of that peach from the opposite side, not knowing that it's completely filled with Japanese beetles. Or if you tried to pluck it, it'd crumple in your hand like a Christmas ornament that you gripped too harshly. The flower is on the other side. That's just not going to be able to be entered into the flower festival or anything like that. Just much too damaged. And they love to feed on all these different things. Unfortunately, they're also a pest as an immature. They feed mostly on turf roots as immatures. The white grubs that they produce are a part of the complex of white grubs that we deal with in Kentucky. So these are similar looking larvae that are C-shaped, kind of a white creamy color, orange brown dots along the side. Those are their spiracles or their breathing holes. And they kind of have an orange red head as well. They will feed on potatoes. They'll feed on the roots of certain crop plants as well. But by and large, these are turf grass problems. The grubs that we see in the state can be green June beetle grubs, We have May-June beetle grubs, also known as the multi-year grubs. The mass chafer used to be the most common white grub in the state, but the Japanese beetle has outcompeted it. You can see the Japanese beetle grub is the smallest of the different species out there. But if you want a definitive identification, you have to look at the posterior tip of their abdomen. There's a series of hairs at that place. So basically, I'm using scientific terms to say you're going to look at their hairy grub butts, and you're going to look for patterns in the hair. These are called the raster pattern. The raster patterns differ between species. The main point here is Japanese beetles have a V at the tip of their abdomen. You can see it in the diagram here, and then the V in actuality at the tip of that abdomen. So they have a V back there, V for victory, because it seems like they defeat us at every turn, right? They feed at the soil thatch interface. They like the root area, so they're munching that up with very powerful jaws. You'll see them kind of spaced out in the soil if you dig them up, because they will also bite at one another with those sharp mandibles. The grub damage is at its peak in late summer or early fall. The symptoms would be that the turf is brown. It looks like straw mixed in with the green grass. And when you go to pick up on it, it rolls back very easily, like a rug. There's no more root there to hold the turf in place. So everything that's kind of netted together by thatch and soil, it just rolls up like a carpet from a floor, from a hardwood floor. Secondary pest problems can occur with grubs as well. Raccoons, various vertebrates will show up to consume them. So they'll make these holes in your yard trying to feed on them. They'll leave other gifts behind as they feed. We can see some fecal material here. If you see that the turf has been rolled and there's kind of this pile of grass to the side of a hole, each side of the hole, that's most likely a raccoon. If it looks like somebody inserted a funnel in the ground, that's most likely a skunk. What we're seeing here is most likely skunk damage in these images. The skunks will just push their face into the ground to slurp up these delicious land shrimp. My former advisor, Dan Potter, he always joked that this must be how Long John Silver's sells shrimp for so cheap. They just rustle up these grubs or get the skunks to do it for them, and then they fry those up instead of actual shrimps. They are cousins, so there's a possibility, I suppose. This is what I was mentioning before. These raccoons have rolled this turf up. If they would just put it back when they were done, they'd almost be helpful. But unfortunately, they leave these kind of piles of messes. And then the skunks, they probe with that snout as they go through. In terms of managing these pests, that's what most people want to know, is how do you get rid of them? Then the fact of the matter is we'll never be free of them. This is an invasive species that's become completely established here in the United States. We can manage them or suppress them if that nomenclature rings more true with you. You're never going to get rid of all of them, but we can keep their numbers below levels that they cause actual harm to our plants that we're trying to protect. They're just so evil, they're not going to go away. And we have to try and kind of come up with integrated pest management strategies to keep their population levels suppressed. One sort of disclaimer with this is I get a lot of calls that they'll have sprayed their yard for grubs. And when they do that, they suddenly expect there to be no adults the following summer or that same year. And that's just not how this works. You can treat for grubs in your yard, but unless everybody in a 5-mile radius of you did so as well, there's still going to be adults that emerge from wild areas, from other lawns, and they will come visit your property just as quickly as they will visit the ones that they were born in. The same is true if you spray for adults. You may kill adults that feed on your linden tree or on your roses, but unless you treated the yard as well, some adults could come through and lay their eggs in the grass, and then those will be able to develop. We have to be prepared to tackle both sides of this coin. Starting with the grubs, there's 2 approaches to a grub control program. You can either be preventive or you can do a rescue treatment. The key differences here are in times of application and then kind of the amount of damage that the turf can actually accept. The preventive is the one that most people turn to. These are when you treat the lawn or the grass area with either the neonicotinoids or the anthranilic diamides. For those of you who are homeowners, the easiest one to remember here will be Scott's Grub-X. That's the most commonly used homeowner product for white grubs. It contains the same active ingredient as acelepryn. It doesn't have any impact on non-target organisms in the turf, so it doesn't kill earthworms or ants. It doesn't harm spiders. It's going to be a much more environmentally friendly product than some of the other ones that are listed here. So that's the one if you're doing home stuff to turn to. If you're more of a professional, you can see some other trade names that you might encounter, like Merit or Acelepryn or Arena. The optimal timing to put this preventive application out is from May to about mid-July. You want to get it out before the flight really begins. So June is kind of the prime time. But if you can think about it, between Mother's Day and 4th of July, if you can get the preventive product down in that window, you will be successful in control. This seems kind of counterintuitive because you're putting a product out when the pest that you're targeting isn't present. That's not when the grubs are around. The reason that we do this is so that the plant has time to absorb these products. They are systemic. So you put them on the soil, the plant absorbs it after you irrigate it, and then it's protected for the entire growing season. And it'll get those grubs later on when they do show up. If you go out in July and put this down, or August, there's not enough time to get it into the plant, and the grubs are too big and strong, and they are able to defeat the insecticide. So this is the optimal timing for this preventive control. Modern grub products are very well studied. They work very well for preventive purposes. You can see that here in this trial that was done in Kentucky. The one side that's treated and the other one that's not helps to sort of evoke the fact that these preventive products do prevent damage. You have to water it in. That's either done with a sprinkler or a hose. You can do it with a watering can. You have to get the product in the root zone in order for it to be systemically transferred. It's not going to be absorbed through the leafy material. The rescue treatments for grubs are done after damage has already occurred. You go out, you see a brown spot in your yard, you pick up on it, and you find all of these wiggly grubs underneath, and you want revenge. You can spray them and kill them. The grass won't turn green after you put the insecticide out, but it is something that will hopefully cut down on problems for the next year. So the problem here is that you're not going to get them all. You can only get about 75% control when the grubs are about this big. The other thing is that there's only about 2 main products used for this, Dialox and Arena. They are harder to find nowadays, and they are heavier duty chemistries. They hit pollinators, they hurt earthworms, and so it's a little less environmentally friendly. Acelepryn or Scott's GrubX, it's not a curative product. You can't go out in September when you would be doing most of these applications and have success. There are some cultural methods that we can use to interfere with grub establishment. You can withhold irrigation. You can fertilize in the spring with aluminum sulfate, but these are things that don't necessarily appeal with a lot of people. There are foliar sprays that you can do at peak flight, mainly Acelepryn. That would be something you would have to hire a professional arborist or a professional pest control operator to do, but it does provide 4 weeks of residual protection on your trees and on your shrubs. A little shorter period of time would be found with things like Tall Star, Scimitar, and Tempo. These are pyrethroid products that last 2 to 3 weeks. And then Onyx, that gives you about the same 4-week window of control as Acelepryn. 7 used to be Carbaryl, but is now a pyrethroid product. It still provides you about that 1 to 2 week residual. Some of the versions of 7 you'll find on the shelf probably get closer to the 3. If you get cyhalothrin or cypermethrin in that product, you would see that kind of control. You can do soil applied treatments of imidacloprid, which is found in Bayer Advanced Tree and Shrub. If you put that down in April and May, it'll protect your trees throughout the growing season. It'll be absorbed from the root zone, and the beetles, when they feed on the leaves, they'll be killed. The only catch is you can't use it on lindens. It is banned from use on those trees after an event that happened in Oregon a few years ago. You have to pull the mulch back from the base of the tree. I know we all like to mulch around them. Otherwise, the product will get caught up in the mulch. And usually you want to wait until after the flowers have fallen from the tree just to make sure you don't harm pollinators.